Warning, this video contains in-depth spoilers regarding Shadowrun Returns, Shadowrun Dragonfall, and Shadowrun Hong Kong. I recommend you play those games before watching. Let us start from the beginning. In 2011, the awakening happens and magic returns. Some humans start mutating into dwarves, elves, orcs, and even trolls, thus meta-humanity is born, while ancient creatures like dragons are seen for the first time in thousands of years. This is the world of Shadowrun, a famous pen and paper role-playing game franchise from the late 80s. But why is it called that? Well, Shadowrunners are essentially freelance urban mercenaries with a focus on industrial espionage, since the world is now controlled by corporations and they're all too eager to hire disposable agents for their secret operations. This is the lens through which the world is generally viewed by the players. There are two recurring elements that define the gameplay. One is that cybernetic implants hurt magical abilities, so you must specialize in either technology or magic. You can be a hybrid, but you suffer the consequences. The second one is that computers are now unified by a virtual world called the Matrix. This was before the movie, which can be accessed by those who plug their brains into computers. These people are called Deckers, and they have their own rules for operating in the cyber world. With all that being said, I understand William Gibson when he expresses dislike towards Shadowrun. The father of cyberpunk is not keen on seeing a futuristic setting populated by fantasy Tolkien elements. It is like something that comes from either hardcore fanfiction or cynical commercialism. However, it should be noted that there was always a battle for the soul of this franchise in the source material, two perspectives from which Shadowrun could be experienced. There is this techno-fetishistic aspect that looked like Mission Impossible meets Lord of the Rings, where players would spend hours looking through the books to make the biggest cyber-augmented guys that went to fight robots with diamond-plated katanas. But there was also a low-key neo-noir aspect where the larger epic meta-plot of the world was ignored and you were dealing with mundane threats like gangs. And there was a bigger focus on characters. I am ever so happy that when developers Harebrained Schemes, led by Shadowrun creator Jordan Weisman, started making games in this universe via the crowdfunding site Kickstarter, they chose the noir approach. The first of these games was Shadowrun Returns, which was an overall positive mixed bag, if I can phrase it that way. It was a linear experience with simplistic combat, incredibly bad AI, and a very unbalanced character creation system, but in spite of all that, it was top-notch in the atmosphere department. While short, the story and pacing formed an excellent cyberpunk neo-noir experience, with magic not disrupting this, due to the fact that the people of these stories had realistic motivations and reactions. Take the infamous Warhammer 40k universe, which I personally can't stomach because you could never convince me that something like a love story could happen in it due to how childishly dark and hopeless everything was. Shadowrun, on the other hand, has people with an aura of verisimilitude due to having vices, virtues, and everything in between. After Returns came the DLC called Dragonfall, which was a huge marketing mistake. This was more than what is commonly accepted as downloadable content nowadays. It was its own game, nearly double the size of the original and with quite a few gameplay changes and fixes. But since it was seen as just a DLC, it didn't sell that well until Harebrained released the director's cut as a standalone product, which became the definitive version. Shadowrun Dragonfall was an excellent game that improved almost everything. It opened up and allowed you to choose your own missions, as well as providing permanent companions with their own story which can be used alongside mercenaries to form your team when out on a run. The revamped cover and armor system added quite a bit more tactical depth with a new UI which had less flourish and more functionality. The AI was still a mess though, sadly. I can wholeheartedly say that taken as an entire package, Dragonfall was my favorite RPG of 2014. So now comes Given the fact that I held the previous games in the series in such high regard, I fully admit to being slightly hyped. After all, Harebrained Schemes already proved themselves and this title was hitting all the right notes. The fact that they were exploring a Chinese setting was what I found the most intriguing. With all that being said, let us see how Shadowrun Hong Kong holds up. First off, the game looks superb. One of the advantages of this setting is that there are plenty of opportunities to exercise a wide color palette, from brightly colored neon streets to sterile office environments. Though environmental animations are lackluster, I personally view them in the same light as voice acting, too expensive for the immersion value it adds. The quality of animation needs to match the level of detail to be a cohesive artistic vision, and this means a lot more budget. Keep in mind that this game only had a few $1,000,000 to work with, so it was about doing more with less. My only complaint here is that it doesn't look Asian enough, which weirdly is a snake eating its own tail situation. The typical cyberpunk aesthetic is actually inspired by urban Asian sprawls, and thus when you have cyberpunk Asia, it doesn't look as impressive as it should. Though some things could definitely have been changed for the better. For example, this is what you hear on the railway platform.
Be a safe escalator user. Hold the handrail and take care of children and the elderly.
I wish that would be in Cantonese rather than English. I know that your character automatically translates for you, but it's these little things that add to the experience, and thus I wanted the environment to feel more authentic. The music is really good, but these games don't get points for that anymore. John Everest is an excellent composer, and I like the soundtrack of all three games. I will say though that I wish it would have been less atmospheric and with more oriental elements. I was expecting things like this. But instead there are a lot of violin strings and soft electro elements. Still an excellent soundtrack in the end. This is where things get muddy. Hong Kong has worse pacing than both Returns and Dragonfall. The comparison to the original game is a bit tricky since that one is highly linear, but even so, the story is actually longer plot-wise, since every mission is a main story mission and thus it is more developed. It even has two complementing story arcs. But a real problem comes when you compare Hong Kong to Dragonfall, because the structure is identical. Two introductory missions consist the first act, followed by a set of missions of which a certain percentage needs to be completed to advance as the second act, and you have two final missions as the third act. The issue isn't length here, but the fact that there are many superfluous elements. You and your police friend Duncan, who you haven't seen for 8 years, go to Hong Kong after receiving a call from your foster father, Raymond. Things go very wrong after an ambush by the police and you are forced into the Hong Kong underground due to being labeled as terrorists. From here, you start shadowrunning until enough time passes and a lead eventually points you towards your foster father and the end of the game, but there are just too many story hooks that either don't get developed or just fall short. Your rough character background as a street urchin doesn't really come into play beyond flavor. The conflict between you and Duncan gets resolved rather quickly when you reveal you were trapped in a corporate facility for a long time. The background info regarding your foster father is rather mundane, and the terrorist thing never really means anything. You are never hunted down even when attending parties, which is hard to believe considering the entire Hong Kong police force is gunning for you. And the fact that you are put in charge of a team of Shadowrunners uses some precarious logic. Your boss named Kindly Cheng justifies it by saying you are expendable, but it seems more like a hand wave, since skill comes before expendability, and if you screw up a mission it would hurt her reputation. And on top of all of this is the tedious amount of characters in the main hub, each with his own little story that gets updated after every mission, and you can spend upwards of an hour, which can be more than most Shadowruns, talking to everybody. People will counter by saying that it is just flavor and you can skip it, but this isn't exactly true. There are multiple requirements for the best ending, for which you need to be rather exhaustive when talking to people, plus you get upgrade points if you talk to everybody all the way to the end. Skipping all that leaves a lot to be desired in terms of world building, since hub interactions is the main way through which it is explored, so it is a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation they have created here. Dragonfall did things much better, with you being a Shadowrunner by trade and spiritually inheriting a community that you can choose to look after. There was a smaller amount of people, but they did what they had to do in making the world seem believable. More isn't necessarily better, and Hong Kong's attempts to bloat out the intermission exposition hurts it. Things like Shadowrunner nannies could have easily been edited out, as well as the entire cafe troll family club thing, which doesn't really amount to anything. What Dragonfall also did significantly better was foreshadowing foreshadowing the main plot. After every mission, new tapes of a character narrating his discoveries were available, and they slowly build into something that turns out to be a twist at the end. In Hong Kong, everybody goes on and on about the dreams they are having, but one conversation with the magic vendor reveals 80% of the plot. Demonic beings are feeding on the population of a slum called the Walled City, and bad dreams are one of the side effects. You only get the reason why they are there towards the end, but it is played straight. There is no twist or interesting turn of events. Now, to be fair, Dragonfall also had its issues, such as expecting you to care about a character you only meet for 5 minutes. In regards to constructive criticism, I think the flow would have been much better if you were a Shadowrunner from the start. Your foster father took you and Duncan off the streets, but you couldn't leave them behind, while Duncan became a police officer. The tension pretty much writes itself. Also, it would be more logical for Kindly Cheng to trust you to lead the team, since she could look up your previous achievements. I guess this would be a good time to mention companions. I like them all, with the exception of ISOBEL, who was just boring. Dialogue with her revolves 99% of the time around nothing else except her childhood memories of the Walled City slum. I think the writers tried to subtly portray the fact that she might be autistic, but it ended up with her being a boring obstructionist in dialogue. I will say that her personal mission has this excellent section where you must guide her through social situations with her being totally out of her depth. It was well done. As for the rest of the crew, Duncan is the grounded character that I personally enjoyed talking to. He kept things very relatable. GOBBET is the wacky character, and I'm glad that they didn't overdo it. She can be serious when the situation calls for it. I just wish they would have explored her rat motif more, given that she is a rat shaman. Next up is GAICHU, which has the stereotypical samurai traits, but also rejects a lot of traditions when he becomes a ghoul. I especially like the moments when you talk about mundane things with him, like hunting or his past lovers, because a character like this really needs a lot of humanity to make work. And finally, you have RACTER, which is my favorite by far. One of the better written evil characters that I have seen in gaming. He's a mechanical genius that put his instincts into his drone, and a medically diagnosed psychopath that still maintains social behavior. RACTER realizes the value of allies and so has no inclination towards killing everybody left and right. I am quite glad they didn't make him a misanthrope and kept him grounded, though this suffers a little when he gets all visionary about the singularity towards the end. Being a passionate scientist would have been enough for this character. The last thing I want to mention here is the decided lack of oriental elements. With the exception of GAICHU, all of them could have been met in Seattle or Berlin without batting an eye. I know the world of Shadowrun is heavily globalized, but I feel like an opportunity was missed here. Shadowrun Hong Kong is more of a peer to Shadowrun Dragonfall rather than a descendant, the only major exception being the revamped Matrix segments, which I will get to later. The original Returns gameplay had a major problem with the lack of damage mitigation. It was too simplistic and it encouraged just burst damaging everything you see. Dragonfall changed the burst favor combat by adding armor and thus having some form of consistent damage mitigation, while also adding flanking rules which made cover and mobility a much bigger focus. There is an issue here though, due to the fact that innate evasion was still left in by way of the dodge stat mostly. It made sense in the simplistic combat of Returns, but when cover plays such an important part, it cheapens the experience. There is a reason why tactical games like XCOM, both old and new, are very careful with native evasion bonuses, and give certain hit chances when being right next to someone. This makes mobility much more important since you can guarantee hits by running up to the enemies, but that will also expose you. In Shadowrun, especially on the higher difficulty levels, it is quite frustrating to have a 70% chance to hit someone who is right next to you. I know there are melee oriented builds that benefit the most from the dodge stat, but I think that a samurai character in Hong Kong which has stances that give him automatic cover even while out in the open is a much more interesting way of treating defense. Honestly, Dragonfall and Hong Kong play the exact same way with one major difference. The latter is much easier. There are fewer enemies that hit for less, it is as simple as that, though I do think that they try to compensate for this by giving you very little money this time around. It is quite possible to not have enough money to buy everything you want by the end, which honestly feels unrewarding because it isn't a matter of choice. High risk, high reward design is always more interesting than a bland, boring, balanced design. And of course, how could I not mention the fact that Hong Kong continues the tradition of brain dead AI. Essentially, the vast majority of enemies only attack once, which makes things very easy with a modicum of focus and tactics on the player's part. This is something specifically enforced within the game scripts. I checked, it is a deliberate design decision. I understand it is meant to balance the fact that you are usually in numerical inferiority, but this is a very cheap way to do it. If they would remove the AP critical hits, which are too volatile in terms of deciding victory, while also rebalancing health stats for higher lethality, especially out of cover, I think Harebrained would reach a much more organic state of affairs for the AI. But the biggest change in Shadowrun Hong Kong is the revamped Matrix, which sadly I don't like. First off, the whole point of the Matrix mechanic is to have the engaging scenario where your decker is moving in cyberspace while your other teammates defend him. Different triggers within cyberspace allowing interaction between the two gameplay loops. Hong Kong features a real-time stealth system where you must evade the AI's line of sight, but since this happens in real time, only once you get caught does it switch over to turn-based and you have simultaneous control over the real world and the Matrix. The stealth itself is mostly terrible due to the click-based controls that never feel comfortable due to the engine clearly not being made for real-time mechanics. Not to mention you can just kill one of the key tracers that form the stealth puzzle and easily pass it that way. Since there is no reward to how well you stealth, you either do or don't, the detection level doesn't matter. There is also a two-part minigame aspect to hacking consisting of Simon Says and a basic exercise in observation. First of all, it is badly explained. I bet most people didn't figure out they could stack time with the Simon Says puzzle until later in the game, and beyond that it is just tedious. I found this stuff boring when I was 5 years old. How do you think I feel about it now? To me, this whole thing reeks of incompetence. They wanted to change the Matrix, but they had no idea what to add, so they just try to be different, subverting the very point of the Matrix in the process. The Prosperity Tower mission features the Matrix the most, resulting in a ridiculous length, which makes it the worst mission in the entire game. You are just going through the motions, silly motions, and it takes forever. I hope that for the next game they go back to the drawing board and scrap the real-time element. I will understand if people complain that the beginning feels like a visual novel, because Hong Kong has a lot of encounters that can be solved through dialogue, and with the beginning being so exposition heavy, it is quite possible to go through the first 4 hours with almost no combat. And even when the game opens up and allows you to choose between 3 missions, one of them is a very long serial killer investigation quest that can be solved in a non-combat way, potentially stretching the writing bloat even further. They should have removed the second introductory mission in the Walled City, which is just heavy-handed foreshadowing, and replace it with the investigation one. It can be easily justified through the writing, since the community affected by the serial killings also takes care to hide your identity from the authorities, and you can say the murders have shaken them up and they can't help you until they are solved. It would also work from your boss's point of view, since the killings are incredibly brutal and indicate that something very vicious is doing them, so being able to find the killer and stop him would be a good Shadowrunner's test. Another bonus would be that it allows for you to have all the companions when the game opens up, since one of them is obtained through this mission. I would also like to say that I am disappointed by the stealth feature, which allows you to get the first strike and position yourself. It works well, but it has so much wasted potential in regards to encounter design. It never goes to being more than just getting the first strike in. But anyway, when the game does open up and you get to the good parts, except the aforementioned Prosperity Tower, it really does shine, being on par with Dragonfall. Maybe a bit worse, since there are a lot of ideas that are criminally underused. There is one encounter and only one mission that has a series of monsters that teleport you to another dimension if they touch you. This deserves so much more development. They could have made an entire dungeon based on such creatures. It is also a little immersion breaking that you can just talk your way into people's good graces, given the fact that you are a labeled terrorist, look like you are ready to wage war on your own, and you could even have a samurai ghoul in your party. When Returns or Dragonfall did the subterfuge thing, they at least provided the janitor outfit from the beginning, and had a much more believable setup where you didn't just wander all over the corporate building. Overall, I think my favorite encounter was the one where you steal Elven immortality research, since it is the best example of balancing combat with dialogue and choices. Sadly, not all are this well made. And I guess I should mention that the ending fight has some interesting bits, but it is much too easy. I found it to be a major downgrade from Dragonfall's ending, which I consider the quintessential Shadowrun encounter, because it required you to fight in both the real world and the Matrix while under considerable pressure. And you know what, I even like the ending of Returns more than Hong Kong. At least it had a unique mechanic associated with it, and you are under the danger of being swarmed if you didn't move quickly. In the end, Shadowrun Hong Kong doesn't represent the leaping quality that Dragonfall represented in relation to Shadowrun Returns, but it still holds its own as a cyberpunk adventure, and I'm not ashamed to say that right now I would still buy one of these campaigns each year. Though I will say that a large part of this has to do with the theme, because if we abstracted that and only analyzed the systems, there is more bad than good. Trevor King Yost and Kevin Maloney have yet to prove they are good video game designers. I mean, even the interface. Take a look at how many clicks it takes to trade and apply medkits to your characters. This is not okay. But we must judge games as the sum total of their parts, and Shadowrun Hong Kong clearly wins out in this regard, especially when it comes to the atmosphere and the writing, which I consider above average by industry standards. Hopefully the next iteration of this series will manage to fully realize the promise of a Shadowrun game without bloating things. A fetch quest is a fetch quest no matter the settings. It is about quality, not quantity.